The United States of America have always been seen as a land of opportunity for centuries. Many Europeans that struggle from their homelands by political, agricultural, they were attracted by demands for labor, the promise of land, and democratic ideals. One group of people that also struggled and needed to move to the United States of America was the Scandinavian. Scandinavia is located in the northern Europe, including three countries, which are Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. These Viking heritage countries sailed to America since the Viking era, but didn't really set up any official colonization. Later, Midwestern American states will become the area with the largest number of Scandinavians beside their homeland. So what made them move from their beautiful hometown to United States of America? Start with Sweden, which was the country with the highest number of immigration among Denmark and Norway during the 19th century. Although the big waves were in the 19th century, the first group of Swedish people traveled to America in 1638. The company called New Sweden Company planned to export tobacco and fur in North America. The duty of leading the ship was taken by Peter Minuit, a Dutch explorer. By March 1638, they arrived at Delaware River and stopped at Wilmington, Delaware. Their land was built in prime territory for trading with the native. It was also not occupied by other Europeans yet. When the fort was complete, the colonists hoisted the Swedish flag, fired celebratory cannon shots, and christened it Fort Christina, after the Queen of Sweden. However, the Dutch believed that New Sweden is their colony and sent the threatening letters to Peter Minuit, and he ignored it because he thought the Dutch didn't have enough troops to run him off. The New Sweden settlers began a peaceful trade with nearby tribes, but they suffered a significant setback in August 1638, when Peter Minuit died in Caribbean while trying to sail back to Sweden. His colony soldiered on for the next couple years, survived on corn and other goods bought from the Native Americans and nearby British and Dutch. Until 1643, when a formidable Swedish military officer named Johan Prince took over as governor. Shortly after his arrival, the Swedes reinforced Fort Christina and established Fort Elfborg and a new Gothenburg, two additional bastions on the Delaware River. They also increased their trade with the local tribes and began growing food and tobacco crops on plantations. Moreover, they also introduced Lutheran Christianity to the New World. But the most influential was their habit of building log cabins, which later became a fixture of North American architecture. The New Sweden colony never became as successful as its competitors like Dutch and English. Part of the problem was a near constant lack of manpower and government support. The colony's population was often less than 200, and interest in immigrating was almost non-existent back in Sweden. Settlers were so hard to come by that the Swedish crown eventually resorted to forcing petty criminals and military deserters to serve, but the colony was still largely ignored. In 1647, a Dutchman named Peter Stuyvesant took over as Director General of neighboring settlement of New Netherland. Under his rule, the Dutch took a more strict approach to the Swedish by restricting New Sweden's access to the Delaware River and squeezing it out of the fur trade. In 1651, meanwhile, the Dutch built a stronghold called Fort Casimir, only a few miles away from Fort Christina. Having survived for some 17 years, New Sweden ceased to exist as an independent settlement. Despite its failure, the New Sweden would prove to be the only first chapter in the history of the Swedes in North America. While Scandinavian immigration to the colonies slowed in the trickle during the 1700s, It rose again during the late 19th century and early 20th centuries, when some 1.3 million Swedes relocated to the United States. During the 19th and early 20th century, 1.3 million Swedes left their home country to the United States of America. There were reasons that made them leave their own land. Sweden's population doubled between 1775 and 1865. Normally, farmland will be inherited by the oldest child, but because of the population growth among families, there was not enough land for every child to do agriculture. Moreover, in the 1860s, the Swedes faced an economic crisis and famine, which encouraged them to leave and find a new land for better life. Also, religion does play a role in this situation. The religious repression practiced by the Swedish Lutheran Church was widely resented, as was an barrier of the Swedish monarchy. There was an invite brochure to come to Iowa and Nebraska by claiming that they have fertile land and low taxes. Also, some of the Swedes in America sent a letter to their families to come to the United States. The early wave of immigration in the 1840s and 1850s was directed toward rural areas of Illinois and Iowa, especially the Mississippi River and Chicago. However, in the 1860s and 1870s, immigration shifted toward Minnesota and the upper Midwest. In the 1880s, rural migration spread to Kansas, Nebraska, and Dakotas. The Americans' Depression of 1893 slowed Swedish immigration until the first decade of the 20th century, and World War I eventually stopped immigration of the Swedes. The journey from Sweden was difficult. There was no direct ship from Sweden to America, so most sailed to England, then traveled to Liverpool to get on the ship to the United States. The experience on the ships to America are varied. Some didn't face any problems. On the other hand, there were people that suffered from hunger and storm. Peter Johan Jonsson was one of the immigrants that detailed his experience.
Chicago. Peter Johan Jonsson left Sweden with his family on May 14, 1866. He did not reach Chicago until August 3rd. Over the course of their journey, Peter's father and young son died, and his wife contracted cholera. Peter's story is similar to that of many other immigrants. It was a difficult journey, and at times he struggled over his decision to leave Sweden. For some immigrants, life in America was far worse than life in Sweden. Others were able to reach their American dream.
The majority of these immigrants, after arriving in East Coast port cities, quickly made their way to the new states and territories of the Midwest, drawn by the promise of open land and by the American letters. In addition, many immigrants were aggressively recruited by representatives of the United States, as well as a local government seeking a new settlers for remote parts of the country. Recruiters and correspondents alike extol the bounties of the American landscape and sometimes provide exaggerated accounts of the comfort and profitability of settler life. In 1850, the Swedish novelist and feminist Fredrika Bremer visited a group of Swedish farmers in Pine Lake and found their daily existence to be more difficult than some descriptions have promised. The first wave of migration, the Swedes were also subject to certain stereotypes and prejudice. The expression "dumb Swede" was established as they had difficulty learning English.
He's saying we'll make our own luck, you dumb Swede.
There were entertainment shows which used a character called Jan Jonsson when poking fun at Swedes. He was dumb, clumsy, drank too much, and talked with a funny accent.
You dumb Swede. Yeah, dumb Swede. A dumb Scot.
Many also complained about the smell of the Swedes. that was considered to smell fishy like herrings. In 1901, Horace Glenn wrote, "Walking behind a string of sweets is impossible to a person with a delicate nose. It's an odor which could only come from generation of unwashed ancestor." By the 1930s, assimilation into American lifestyle was almost complete, with few experience of hostility or discrimination. A common stereotype of 19th century Swedish immigrants was that they were farmers and agricultural laborers in the rural areas, or domestic servants in urban areas. There was a truth in this stereotype, since such occupations were often filled by a newly arrived immigrants. Swedish American cooking is quite ordinary. Traditional dishes represent the cooking of the Swedish countryside, which is heavily weighed toward meat, fish, potatoes, and other starches. In the area of baked goods, however, Swedish American cooks produce delicious breads, cookies, and other delights. The holiday season, especially Christmas, are times for special ethnic dishes such as lutefisk, meatballs, and ham, which are arranged on a buffet-style smorgasbord table. The first person is Alexander Samuelsson. Samuelsson immigrated from Sweden to the United States in 1883. Alexander Samuelsson was a glass engineer, and in 1950, he designed the famous Coca-Cola contour bottle, which was introduced in 1916. The bottle is universally recognized and also become one of the symbolics of Americans. Second is Carl Eric Wickman, founder of the American bus company Greyhound Lines. He immigrated from Sweden to the United States in 1905 and settled in Hibbing, Minnesota. Once in America, he changed his typical Dalarna name to Carl Eric Wickman from Mattister. In 1916, he married a Swedish-American woman, Olga Roden. The couple had two children, Robert and Peggy. By 1934, Wickman had 50 buses in his business. The last famous people is Edwin Buzz Aldrin, the Swedish-American engineer and former American astronaut, and the second person to walk on the moon. Born on January 20, 1930 in Montclair, New Jersey. In 1969, he was the lunar module pilot on Apollo 11, the first manned lunar landing in history following mission Commander Neil Armstrong. He is a retired colonel in the United States Air Force and a USAF command pilot and astronaut.
Moving to the next country between 1825 and 1925. More than 860 Norwegians immigrate to the North America, or about one-third of Norway population, with the majority settling in the United States and lesser number migrating to Canada. With the exceptions of Ireland, no single country contributes a larger percentage of its population to the United States than Norway. Norwegians' immigration through the years was predominantly motivated by the economics. Also, there were plagues that caused by the crop failures, such as the European potato failures of 1840s and the famine of 1866 to 1868. Norwegian agricultural resources were unable to keep up with population growth, and the enactment of the Homestead Act in the US, which is a law that gave an applicant ownership of land at little or no cost. This encouraged Norwegians westward with each passing year. The pioneer migration. Norwegian overseas immigration began earlier than in the other Nordic lands, commencing dramatically on July 4, 1825, with the sailing of the tiny sloop Restoration, were often called the Nose Mayflower from the Stavanger on the southwestern coast of Norway. Their initial immigrations occurred in a district with historical tie to England, where the idea of immigration as an alternative to staying at home originated. As early as 1821, the enigmatic Waddler Crank Pearson, the pathfinder of Norwegian immigration, traveled to America as an agent for the pioneer immigrants. Many Lutheran priests and Quakers chose to immigrate as a result of the persecution by the Lutheran clergy because of their law. Religious oppressions did not enter into the subsequent immigration. In 1824, Pearson returned briefly to Norway to advise the immigrants, but was back in the United States to meet the sloopers, as they were called because they sailed on the sloop. The Restoration landed in New York on October 9, 1825, with a boatload of 53 immigrants, one of them a baby girl born during an adventure voyage of 14 weeks. On their 14-week journey, they sailed south to Madeira and the island of Portugal, then crossed the broad expanse of the Atlantic. They reached the Caribbean having run dry of water. It has further problems upon reaching New York since the ships carry more passengers than permitted by migration laws, and the captain of the ship was held in jail until the fines could be paid. Greeted in New York by Crank Pearson, the group made their way across the Erie Canal to settle in Kendall, New York, on the bank of the Lake Ontario. Annual immigration did not commence until 1836, but a contact has been made with the New World. Individuals has gone to America in their entwining years, and even visit Norway to report on life there. The Norwegian exodus rose in the 1840s, and by 1865, nearly 80,000 Norwegians has entered the United States. From the southwestern coastal areas, the immigrant fever has moved along the west coast and inland to the central highland region. Even though no part of Norway was entirely untouched by the overseas exodus, the majority of immigrants in this founding phase of the movement came from the inner fjord district in the West Norway and the mountain valley of East Norway. It was an immigration of rural folk with a strong family composition. Their move was prominent. They sought a new life in America for themselves and their descendants. As a result, the immigration community that developed in America reflects the custom, manners, and regions as well as secular values of people from their home district in the old nations, and conveys a strong sense of familial and communal bond. Significant wave. The number of Atlantic crossings significantly increased after the Civil War. The period of mass migrations was heralded when the number of Norwegian immigrants increased from 4,000 in 1865 to 15,726 in 1866. Around 110,000 Norwegians left the country of origin in the 8 years leading up to 1873 when the migration began. The second and largest phase of immigration, which lasts 14 years from 1880 to 1893, saw an average of 18,290 people leave each year, or 10 out of every 1,000 Norwegians. Norway has the second highest rate of immigration in Europe at this period. Only Ireland was higher. Although there was significant immigration from Norway in the 1920s as well, the country's final mass exodus took place in the first decade of the 20th century. Immigration from its beginning in 1825 until the present has affected 900,000 people. Of the total immigration, 87% or 780,000 Norwegians left in the period between 1865 and 1930. Settlement. The majority of pioneer immigrants, known as loopers, traveled to Orion County in western New York State and settled in what is now Kendall Township with the help of American Quakers. By establishing a community in the Illinois regions around the Fork River in the middle of the 1830s, the Kendall settlers gave the Norwegian westward immigrants support. Around the same time, a tiny urban community of Norwegians began to form in Chicago. Now, immigrants' community were prepared to receive the yearly influx of Norwegian immigrants that has been arriving since 1836. Norwegian settlers entered Wisconsin from Illinois, following the border population's movement to the northwest. Up to the Civil War, Wisconsin remained the center of Norwegian American activities. Norwegian land seekers started arriving in Iowa and Minnesota in the 1850s, and by the 1870s, there was a significant influx into the Dakotas. The majority of Norwegian agrarian settlements developed in the northern regions of the so-called Homestead Act triangle between the Mississippi and the Missouri rivers. For the most part, immigrants settled in the upper Midwest. In 1910, the region of the country was home to over 80% of the 1 million or more Norwegian Americans, including both immigrants and their offspring. Minnesota has the highest percentage of Norwegian Americans living there, or around 51.7% in 1990. For secular and religious activity, Minneapolis served as a Norwegian American capital. Moreover, the Puget Sound area of the Pacific Northwest and Seattle in particular developed into another center for immigrant life. Norwegian communities also developed in Texas, Alaska, and the border Brooklyn area of New York. In 1990, Wisconsin has the second highest Norwegian population after Minnesota, followed by California, Washington, and North Dakota. Famous person: Leif Erikson. Erikson was a Norse explorer born to the father Erik the Great, famous for founding the first colonies in Greenland. Erikson explored to the west and is regarded as the first European to discover America after he settled in Vinland, which is on the tip of modern-day Canada. Moving to the next person, Kring Pearson, born in Norway. Pearson led the first Norwegian immigrants west to America on the Norwegian sloop, the Restorations in 1825. Pearson moved further west to Iowa and eventually settled in Texas, where he remained until his death in 1865. King Olav of Norway visits his burial place in Nos, Texas in 1982 to celebrate the 200th anniversary of his birth. Next, Henrik Ibsen, a famous 19th century Norwegian playwright, is referred to around the world as the father of realism. Ibsen has been regarded as the most important playwright since Shakespeare in his work introduced modernism to the theater. Culture. Since Norway historically is a Christian Lutheran country, the constitution states that the Norwegian culture and laws should reflect Christian Lutheran values and humanitarian principles. The Christian traditions are also reflected in national holidays like Christmas and Easter. For example, each Christmas, Norwegian Americans head to the nearest Knott's Dairy to buy lutefisk that once was a stapler for presents in Norway. They grated potatoes for lift in flat prison bread and loaded butter cookies on Kermadec Island for their holiday celebrations. There are more than 4.5 million people of Norwegian ancestry in the United States today. Norwegian Americans actively celebrate and maintain their heritage in many ways. Norwegian cuisine in its traditional form was based largely on the natural materials readily available in Norway and by its geography. Norwegian food has a strong focus on fish and game. Toward the end of the century, Lutefisk became known as a Norwegian American dish. It was served at lodge meetings, festive banquets, and church suppers, more regularly during the Christmas season. On October 9, Nordic communities worldwide will celebrate Leif Erikson Day, remembering the explorer credited with bringing the first Nordic people to America around the year 1000. The holiday has been adopted by a variety of states throughout the 20th century and represents a celebration of Norwegian explorers, the spirit of discovery, and the contributions of Norwegians in America.
A toast to Leif Erikson and to the Scandinavians who have gathered here today in his honor. Thank you very much for being here. I think we're ready to gather indoors. And we have proclamations from the White House and also from Mayor Jackson.
Stereotype. Here are some of the most popular stereotypes nowadays. First, all Norwegians are tall. This is one Norwegian stereotype that definitely has some truth to it. The average Norwegian is indeed tall, with men measuring is at 179 cm or just over 5 feet 10 inches tall, while Norwegian women are on average 165 cm or just over 5 feet 5 inches tall. Second, all Norwegians are blonde-haired and blue-eyed. This is probably the most common Norwegian stereotype, and yes, a lot of Norwegians are indeed blonde-haired and blue-eyed. But that doesn't mean that all of them are. There are a wide variety in Norwegian looks, just like in any other country. Third, Norwegians only eat fish. Norwegian seafood is worldwide renowned, but saying Norwegians only eat fish is really not true. Not all Norwegians live near the sea or even like fish. Inland, you're just as likely to find Norwegian dishes made with beef, pork, or chicken. Norwegian food may not be as spicy as some other cuisines, but that doesn't mean it's bland. Norwegian cuisine actually has a lot of variety and flavor. So if you're not ever in Norway and looking for a unique Norwegian dining experience, you'll definitely be able to find one. The last one. Norwegians are the rednecks. Like most areas of the world, the country of Scandinavia like to tell jokes about each other. And the one you should often hear about Norwegian is that they are all rednecks who doing nothing but live in the country and go fishing. Also back then, it was a stereotype in their Norwegian ancestor. For example, a strong sense of family and national identity, a love of nature, a desire to help those in need, and a willingness to work with others to reach a worthwhile goal. These traits are an integral part of Norwegian's culture.
The last country we are going to talk about is Denmark. From 1820 to 1990, more than 325,000 Danes came to the United States between 1820 and 1850. The number of Danes entering the United States averaged only about 60 each year. However, the majority of immigrant influx between 1860 and 1930. The peak year was 1882, when 11,618 Danes entered the country. Converts to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints or Mormons represent the first significant wave of Danish immigrants to America. Between 1849 and 1904, when Mormons stopped recruiting immigrants, some 17,000 Danish converts and their children made the hazardous journey to the Mormon Zion in Utah, making Danes second only to British in number of foreigners recruited by the Church of the State. Many of these Danes settled in the small farming communities of St. Pete and Sevier counties. South of Salt Lake City, today these counties rank 2nd and 5th respectively among all the counties in the United States in terms of percent of Danish ancestry in the population. Another reason of Danish immigration is Schleswig. Schleswig is a state in Germany and it is bordered by Denmark to the north. Denmark had been forced to surrender Schleswig to Prussia in 1864. In addition, about 150,000 people in North Schleswig were Danish and they were resentful about the situation. The policy of Prussia in Schleswig generally followed that of Germany after Wilhelm I, King of Prussia, was crowned Emperor of Germany in 1871. This meant the abolition of the Danish language in schools and the recruitment of young Danish soldiers to German soldiers between 1864 and 1920. When North Schleswig returned to Denmark as a result of the war, defeats of Germany in World War I, approximately 50,000 North Schleswig immigrants to the United States. According to census data, the majority of these Danes are immigrants from Germany instead of Denmark. After 1865, the majority of Danish immigrants came to America for economic reasons. Denmark's population rose from approximately 900,000 in 1800 to over 2.5 million by 1910. However, Denmark's economy was unable to absorb much of this increase. They started to migrate to nearby cities, or to America appeared to offer the only chance for a better life. Many used Homestead Acts or other generous land policies to become farmers in the United States. By 1900, a Danish area of settlement had spread from Wisconsin across northern Illinois, southern Minnesota, into Iowa, Nebraska, and South Dakota. The largest concentration of these settlers was in western Iowa. As the Midwestern and Eastern regions began to fill with settlers, a variety of immigrant leaders and organizations sought to establish Danish agricultural colonies elsewhere by arranging for land companies to restrict sales in specific tracts to Danes. The Danish Folk Society sponsored several of these colonies, including settlements at Tyler, Minnesota in 1886, Denevang, Texas, 1894, Ascot, Minnesota, 1905, Dagmar, Montana, 1906, and Sylvan, California, 1911. Similar colonies were established in Mississippi, North Dakota, Oregon, Washington, and Alberta. Most of these colonies were quite small and eventually blended into the surrounding community. An exception is Solvang, 45 miles north of Santa Barbara, which has become a major tourist attraction and bills itself today as a quaint Danish village. The earliest immigrants came on sailing ships. Crossing the Atlantic Ocean under sail took 4 to 8 weeks. Tickets were very expensive. During the voyage, a few who could afford to do so traveled in first or second class cabins, but poor immigrants were crowded into steerage, cramped, unsanitary, stinking vermin-infested barrack-like accommodation below deck. They had no fresh food, disease was rampant, and there were frequent burials of those who died at sea. After steamship travel became common in 1860s, the Atlantic crossing was shortened to 10 days, and accommodation were somewhat more comfortable. Still, in 1880s, a steamship ticket would have cost almost a year's wages for Danish farmhand.
Journey times were drastically cut down to more around 8 or 9 days, so it became a lot more comfortable for passengers. Here you can see some examples from inside of the actual ships that sailed the Copenhagen to New York route. As you can see, while the first class cabins are obviously fancier, the third class rooms are still really nice themselves. Their dining rooms had waiters and attendants just like the other higher classes, so it must have been quite the exciting experience getting to travel in such a luxurious ship.
Danes were among the most easily acculturate and assimilate of all American ethnic groups. A variety of studies indicate that, in comparison to other immigrants, they were more likely to speak English, become naturalized citizens, Protestant, and marry outside their nationality. Danes were generally literate and understood the democratic process, were Protestant in their religion, and easily blended with the Northern and Western European majority. Because Danes suffered a little challenge to the more established Americans, they seldom encountered resistance. Much that is regarded as Danish national culture today was not widespread in the psyche of Danish immigrants during the 19th century. So, Danish culture that can be seen is food. They brought with them the traditional foods, popular Danish cuisine including kringle, Danish pastry, the puff pancakes, Danish veal and pork meatballs, pork roast, and rice pudding. The first famous people that I'm going to present to you is Jørgen Jensen. He was a landscape architect. Jørgen Jensen was born in Denmark on September 13, 1860, to a wealthy farming family. Jensen worked in Florida and then at Luther College in Decorah, Iowa, before moving to Chicago and taking a job as laborer for the West Park Commission. He was soon promoted to foreman. During this time, he was allowed to design and plant a garden of exotic flowers. His design work for the city can be seen at Garfield Park, Humboldt Park, Douglas Park, Pulaski Park, Columbus Park, the North Park Village Nature Center, waterfall, and pond. The next famous people is Jeffrey Preston Bezos. Jeffrey Preston Bezos was born on January 12, 1964, the son of Jacqueline and Theodore Jorgensen, and his ancestry was Danish immigrants. He is the founder, executive chairman, and former president and CEO of Amazon, with a net worth of $128 billion as of February 2023. Bezos is the third wealthiest person in the world. Bezos completely changed the shopping and reading experience for billions of people all over the world. From books, he moved on to the countless millions of other products that could be sold online and shipped right to your door. Also, Amazon has created more jobs in the past decade than.
As a consequence, it showed that Sweden, Norway, and Denmark All of this country contributes more or less to American society, including the culture. Even their incidents happened long time ago, but it still impact and lasts in the present. Members Thanat Pothipiti and Lapasrada Bumphentan. Thank you for your attention.